Hi, everybody. Robeson back at it again. Um, going to change topics a little bit and move in a different direction before we get too far out away from Doc about what we're trying to get accomplished here on this channel. So I wanted to talk about history versus historiography. So the first thing you learn when you in graduate school, you read an article. They give you an article and they tell you that history is completely subjective, right? And you're like, what? My entire life, I thought, I'm exaggerating, but I thought that the intention was it to be for history to be as objective as possible. But what you really understand is that no matter what things you decide to study, what areas you decide to focus on, the individual historian is picking of a snapshot, whether that be time, whether that be a region, whether that be a country. They're picking a snapshot of the bigger story. And so that by itself is subjective. The problem with that is that by itself is fine. The problem with history as it has happened is that each country tells its own history and tells its own history from the perspective of everything that they've done is relatively good. So if you grew up in the 80s like I did, you would read American textbooks, extolling the virtues of the American military, while kind of ignoring the abuses that had been done or overkill that had happened in third world countries in particular. Do you know what I mean? So if you every war that the United States has been in has not been a fight for freedom and defending the American way, right? We know that now, and we can say that comfortably. And I say that as someone who um, you know. Have a great reverence for the military and have great reverence for our soldiers. I have Army folks. My dad was in the Army. My uncle was in the Navy. I have many friends that were in the Naval Academy and things of that nature. So it's not an attack. It's just that what happens with governments is governments lie, and when governments get their hands on information that can be propaganda, they typically, assert influence in those directions. So history can be hyperbolic. It can be misleading. It can be meant to kind of send you in a certain direction. But as long as you have a society where different viewpoints on the same topic are welcomed, then you should have an equilibrium and a balance that allows a healthy discussion on war. So, a perfect example in my history senior thesis class we talked about World War II. And so there would be a range of conversations that would have over World War II and why the US decided to drop the bomb, right? And so some people would say, they dropped the bomb because the Japanese didn't look like them, and there was an element there why that was comfortable. They would have never done that to the Germans, right? There's another argument that was a valid argument that war was very brutal, and the Japanese didn't surrender, and they fought to the end and would fight to the end, and that the bomb was the best um, method or the best way to end the war quickly and without horrific casualties because they were basically at the point of wanting to take over the mainland of Japan. And then there's a third or fourth segment that believes that Russia was turning its attention to Japan because they had a war with Japan years before and had lost, and that there were some things that they maybe had on their agenda that they wanted to recapture from Japan. And so that knowledge that the Russians had turned uh, eastward to come and help finish off Japan might have inspired the U.S. to drop the bomb to get it over with, so they could take the credit. So those are all different ways that we can talk about a topic, and none is necessarily more valid than the other. It depends on your filter. It depends on your perspective, and then how compelling is your argument? What supporting evidence do you have to document it, and things of that nature. And that's all good. I think we do need to get to a point, though, where history, as we get it in each country that we live in, should have the perspective of not just a home country, but also from other countries as well. I think, if we're talking about World War II, in a definitive American, story, we should have the Russian perspective. We should have the Japanese perspective. We should have the German perspective. We should have the British perspective. All of those things, they may overlap and tell the same story, but there's nuances that would be in there that I think would be worth having to give a rich context. So that's history. And we can go on and on about that. And I'll come back again for other times to talk about other segments within that we can get to. But historiography is the topic and the subject and study that I learned about in graduate school. And the definition for historiography is how history is written, recorded, and interpreted over time. So if I write a history story, if I write a history book about Native Americans in the 1800s, right, and I wrote that in 1905, I have the benefit of either having lived in that time period, being able to speak to people who lived in that time period, who had contacts with those people that I'm in touch with, and then over time, that same subject, the way it's depicted, the way it's told, the way that it's defined, might be completely different, and it could be for a number of reasons. Some cases, it could be because over time you gain more information, you have better context, and you're able to say, okay, well, I know this is what people were saying, but there was probably a little bit of hoo ha, pro government, shine on that story or that depiction. And now with a little bit more information, we can say that this common viewpoint was not accurate. This wasn't accurate, and you can gain a greater context. So that is acceptable in a historiographical way, right? With more information, we can and looking at and considering what the running social expectations or social hierarchies were at that time, you can say, look, a lot of the stuff that we got back then was a little bit off because of different reasons, and that's a perfectly valid place to revise history. What's questionable, though, is with the political environment in which history is examined changes radically. Then all of a sudden, stories that we had a really good understanding of over certain periods of time now become turned and twisted into something that's unrecognizable, and then has significant impacts for society and has significant impacts um, for young people who don't have the time to read 25 books on a subject. So we I one of the biggest mistakes that I used to make when I would argue with my friends is that we might talk on a subject, and that person might have read a book or two, and it was a bestseller, and it was definitive, but it's really a secondary source. It's that writer's opinion, and he's crafted that piece of art or piece of work to follow through with what he is postulating, right? And I might have read 20 books on that subject, right, of different backgrounds, from different countries, from different perspectives. And so we are talking two different topics, basically, because what they understand and what I understand are completely different. It doesn't mean that I'm right, but it's just that what I'm thinking about after having read numerous things on this particular topic, and what that person has, having read that one definitive book, it's a tough place to be as a society, and that's kind of what is happening here as we see it. And when we have a discussion about politics, when we have a discussion about history, we have a discussion about almost anything, how we get the information and why the information is being presented the way it's being presented is almost the biggest issue. And so I wanted to put up a couple of things here on history versus historiography to explain how historiography warps something that is kind of objectively or provably true into something that is now a political weapon, right? And so hopefully this will give you a little bit of understanding. And there's so many different examples, but I just picked my favorite ones. So the first one is the three-fifths compromise. So we hear about this all the time. This is kind of in the lead up time, going into the Civil War, where the states that have slaves, and particularly the ones, all of them in the South, but then they were starting to expand westward. They were counting all of their slaves as a part of the population, which is how you get additional seats in Congress. So if you leave the Democrats at the time, that's the party that was supporting slavery. If you leave them to their own devices, and you're in South Carolina and 40-50% of the population are slaves, right? You now have no representation. Those people are not being represented by actual government officials because they don't have any citizenship rights. So very similar to what you're seeing with undocumented immigrants in today's days. It's literally the same issue, um, just different outcomes for those people, but the same issue politically is that people who are not on the books or shouldn't be on the books are being put on the books, and it benefits the group that keeps those groups in a difficult place. So the slave states wanted count all of the slaves individually. So if there's 400,000 slaves in South Carolina, they wanted to count all 400,000 people. The Republicans and the those who were against the expansion of slavery, they said, no, you can't do that. They're not citizens. They're not getting the benefits of citizenship. You can't do that. So the compromise was to count three slaves out of every five. Okay. There's no mention that they're not human beings. There's no mention that they are not, uh, uh, they're considered less than human or anything else, or subhuman or anything else than that. Doesn't mean that slavery wasn't brutal. It was. It doesn't mean that there wasn't, a lot of inhumane things that were being done to them in everywhere that it happens. No question about it. But the truth is the truth. And so that story, the Three-Fifth Compromise, was the anti-slavery proponents winning and keeping the power of counting, disproportionately counting slaves as population down. Had that not gone through, then you would see a huge number of slave states continue to come into the fore, and the United States might have become a fully slave state. So, it's just maddening to see how over time the story became slaves were considered three-fifths of a human being. So the next one is another popular one. This is the history, the actual history. British allied tribes in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 were defeated by the U.S. to remove British presence in the United States. Okay, so from the very first colony, the Virginia colony, the British cultivated relationships with Native American tribes. They actually thought that the Native Americans had the same capabilities and potential that whites did. And so the Powhatan tribe, the first kind of tribe that was that partnered with or had contact with um, the British when they came to Virginia, their elites were brought to England and introduced to Christianity. So from the very beginning, the English were trying to introduce Christianity to the Native American, and they made partnerships with many of them. And so you would see the British and native tribes of different areas work with each other against other tribes for the benefit of conquest or taking expansion of land and things of that nature. So when the Revolutionary War happened, a lot of the a lot of the Native American tribes were allied with the British and were doing deeds and like attacks and raids and things and ambushes against the colonists on behalf of England. And this continued all the way into the war. And so at the end of for Revolutionary War, there was a lot of hard feelings, but there were treaties done with tribes. I think Oneida in New York was one of the tribes that had a good relationship with the U.S. government, and they were left alone. They were able to keep their sovereignty, and they were able to do and exist as they had normally. The tribes that had worked with the British, there was hard feelings, and so in the War of 1812, there was a Shawnee chieftain, Tecumseh, who revived this British Native American alliance, and he actually was in the northeast area of the United States, and he traveled all the way through the South to the Chickasaw, to the Cherokee, to the Seminole, and advocated for Native American tribes joining together in confederation against the American government. So when the War of 1812 is over, that is when the Indian Wars started. So the Creek War down in the South, in the Georgia and those areas, the numerous, I think there was three Seminole Wars that happened during that time, and so these conflicts and it was really from 1816 through the mid 1800s, uh, led to what became known as the Trail of Tears. But the way it's presented by the current way that history is explained is that there was a genocide against Indians, against Native Americans, and um, there was no reason for it other than that they were racism. They were racist. So there has to be more context there, because when you tell history this way, it completely eliminates the brave and valiant defense of their continent that the Native Americans put up against superior forces. So the European, came to North America, in the hundreds of years ago, and it took them until the late 1800s to really consolidate the land. I think that's a great example of the influence and power of Native American tribes. And so when you take that away from a people and turn them into victims, I think it does a disservice, because your children only know life as it's been explained to them, and they don't understand that, yes, I might have been a part of a culture that lost in the battle of civilizations, but we fought way above our weight, and we were cunning and strong and powerful. And those stories, those warriors should be honored for such. But because we go with a victim narrative, again, this is historiography, we don't get to understand how deadly serious the Comanches were, right? We don't understand that the Comanches, scared the Apaches to death, to the point where the Apaches ran to Mexico and asked the Spanish to come and help them, because they were terrified of the Comanches, right? So we don't get to hear about how great some of these, and how powerful and cunning and great some of these tribes were, because we hear of the story, this overall arching story. So as far as the genocide part of it goes, I do think there is a significant marker where the the actions the U.S. government took up to a certain point, I believe, were justified based on what had just happened to the U.S. as a new young country. They had been embarrassed and humiliated in the War of 1812. They already were not protected, and so they made a decision that we have to consolidate the landmass, the continental United States. Otherwise, we will not be safe. And if we did, and War of 1812 showed that, because they were attacked and exposed from the northwest and from the southeast and from the southwest, because almost all of the American colonies at that time or early American states were near the coast. So I would say everything, up until the Mexican American War was relatively justified. I think all of the actions in the plains and on the western part of the United States in the second half of the 19th century, I think that's where you get to a point where all the people that knew why they were fighting against the tribes, that was forgotten, and it was just at this point bloodlust, and they say, "I want to take what I want to take." And I think that there's a lot of evidence to support that too, in terms of the messaging that was going out during that time. So I always try to be fair. We want to be able to tell the good and bad of American history, and we want to be able to support and talk about the bad things that happen to people when great powers and great forces collide. But we also got to be honest about, you know, we can't just tell a story and say that something was bad. What we also have to look at is what options were available. So, and I'll kind of finish on this one note about this topic, is that Andrew Jackson is blamed for his treatment of the Native American, but he had much respect for the Cherokee, and he wrote them a letter because he fought against them in the War of 1812, and he fought against them in his earlier years, and he wrote a letter that said, "Listen, you are great warriors, and we know that our systems are not compatible. We're not going to be able to live together. And so the alternative, and we respect you, and we have reverence for your history and your culture, but we can't have you in our space like this and coexist, because this is going to keep going on. This fighting that happens, these attacks on the plains, these attacks in villages and things, all these types of things are going to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth for unending forever. So the only thing we have as an option is to take you somewhere and remove you. Now, granted, again, if even if that treaty was done um, in good faith, the politicians that come behind didn't make that deal, and so they may choose to go in a different route. And now you have this history of broken treaties, broken promises, and a slippery slope of how a powerful and prideful people get exploited, and it doesn't seem there a way for it to be rectified. And so that is a really sad stain on American governmental history, in terms of what they did and didn't do in relation to treaties that they signed and then reneged on, right? When it comes to the Native American and reservations and things of that nature. So, but this is kind of what we're talking about again: history versus historiography. It's important that we know and start and get these stories out here about what the actual truth is. And we can debate. You can say I don't agree with that or whatever, but this is really the perspective that I think people need to hear to understand that life is complicated. There is no land anywhere in the world that has been held without force. And so when you understand that, as much as we don't like to hear what happened to this people or happened to another group of people, this is just the way the world has always worked. And until we find a better solution, this is this is the unfortunate thing that happens when cultures collide. Um, Third story is history versus historiography. Um, Russia absorbed the brunt of the Nazis in World War II, held their ground and pushed them back. America gave a strong assist in the victory in Europe and handled Japan by itself. Historiography presents World War II as if America won World War II by itself. And again, you can celebrate America's contributions to World War II, and it's amazing what they were able to do in Africa, in Italy, in Japan. Just and then just the manufacturing power to get all of that product out years before they actually entered the war in 1942. It's just unbelievable in terms of production, and they kept the Russians afloat. You could argue and say that they kept the Russians afloat with material while they were fighting, in the early 40s. But it's a disservice to say that Russia didn't have a very compelling and very powerful story to tell about what they did to the best fighting force in the world, which was the Nazis clearly were at that time. So I think that the objective perspective on World War II is that Russia and the United States both won the war, and they both came out as the two most powerful countries in the world. And we saw that play out over the next 60, 70 years. So last story, that was really simple. And then one more is, this is one of my favorites. The percentage of free blacks in America has always been at least 10%. So since 1790s until the 1860, there was always 10 to 13% of the black population in America was free. Okay, they almost all lived exclusively in the South. Now that changes your perspective on history, because now it's a much more complicated issue. So slavery, again, a terrible thing, and slavery anywhere is terrible. And you can, if you understand kind of slavery in the Americas, slavery in Brazil versus slavery in the Caribbean versus slavery in America, there are significant differences, and you can talk about severity or um, practices that in the business models that each territory had about that. But the introduction of free blacks and the large percentage of free blacks, and almost all living in the South, and living in very comfortably in places like Virginia, very comfortably in places like Charleston, South Carolina, very comfortably in places like New Orleans. That opens up a whole nother uh, examination into what are the laws. Like, so when you understand that the first black college, Wilberforce, was created and funded by Southern slave owners to educate their biracial children, that is a complication. When you understand that the American South, or in America, they followed the bastardy laws, the laws that dictate what you do with children born out of wedlock, follow what the British model is. And so there's certain, and Game of Thrones is the one that kind of popped that open in my head. I was like, why do they focus on bastards so much in the Game of Thrones? If you notice the show, and they give them a trade, they give them a skill, and they kind of bring them into the family, usually to do the dirty work or some other function. But this helps explain there are bastardy laws in the United States at that time period that explain why the sons of the sons of slaves, slave masters or slave owners with slave women, were often given a trade. Carpentry. Carpentry, learn how to play music, learn how to read and write. And why that's important is that most of the great slave rebellions of that time period were led by children that were of biracial descent. So Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, they're biracial children of slave owners who were given freedom to move around and given freedom and passes to kind of have freedom of movement. And so that's important to understand and have a better understanding of that period in America. And it's a much more complex issue than we currently know about and get to discuss. And it's important that we get off of that this current narrative that we have, that American slavery was simplistic, brutal, and in the South, and that the North was free. That's not true. The slave, when the Civil War ended, and the Southerners were looking to find a system of laws to control black movement, because of the voting issues and problems that they were seeing relative to their interests. They Jim Crow laws come from the North. Jim Crow laws were the slave codes, that were the black codes that were already in place and had been in place for decades in the North. And so Jim Crow laws were taken from the North and implemented in the South. And that's the Jim Crow that we come to know. So it's important that we can tell history in a way where it's not an emotional thing, that we can point out uh, things that maybe don't assist in a narrative, but are helpful to give context so that people can understand and look at the issues, look at complex issues in a way that we understand. Is the answers are complicated. You're not going to just come up with a simple answer to say this is good, this is all bad, this is that. It's going to be a little bit more nuanced, and we have to be able to start getting to that point so that all of us can have can learn to respect some parts of our history that may have turned out in a bad way against other people, but and also not completely demonize a group of people who've made choices that look and appear bad on paper, but they may not have had a better alternative at the time. So anyway, this is my soapbox for the day. I just wanted to kind of touch on this topic. If you find this interesting, let me know. I'd be happy to revisit and give it more examples.